All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Eli. I'm the pastor here at Nickel City Church. I'll say this now because I don't think I'll see you in the next 3 days, but Merry Christmas, right? I'm so excited about Christmas. I love Christmas season. And so in this Christmas season, we have been in this series called Oh Come, Let Us Adore Him. And this has been a series about worship and the different aspects or the ways that we worship God. And we've been looking at these different aspects or the different ways that we worship God by looking at the Christmas story and by looking at the different ways that the people in the Christmas story worshiped Jesus. And so I am excited to be continuing this today. We're going to be finishing up this series today. Now, let me tell you, if you have missed out on this series, I would encourage you to go on the Nickel City Church app or on our website or on YouTube and get caught up. Watch all of this series, because the idea of this series is that we wouldn't just be stuck into one aspect of worship, but that we would grow and mature, and as we learn more about who God is, that our worship would expand, that we would actually worship in all of these different aspects and all of these different ways. And so I would encourage you to go ahead and do that. This whole series will be uploaded this week, so you can get caught up on any of them. Now, I am feeling pretty good for Christmas. How many of you are like ahead of the game? You're like, I have everything done. I'm ready. I'm ahead of schedule. We got one person. All right. Yes. How many of you are kind of back in the other category where you're like, I have so much to do. I did not know Christmas was this week. I have a lot. Yeah, all right. So my wife and I, we feel pretty good this year. We feel like we're kind of ahead of schedule. We got the presents for the kids, and all that's left to do is to wrap them. So we're on a pretty good track. But today we're going to continue in this Christmas story. We're going to look at some men who brought some presents to Jesus, and we see that they were definitely in the ahead of schedule category. So let's go ahead and look at their story today, the story of the wise men. In Matthew chapter 2, it says this: Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the newborn king of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. Now, I want to pause here just for a moment, because we know that the Christmas story is full of hope and full of joy. And when we hear this story of Jesus, we get excited about it. But we see that was clearly not the case for King Herod or for the surrounding area of Jerusalem. It says that they were deeply disturbed. And so I want to kind of look at why that is. I want to bring a little bit of context to that. And I think this is really interesting. So we don't really know too much about the wise men. We see that they were foreigners, that they were from an eastern land. It doesn't say exactly where they were from, but a lot of scholars believe maybe they came from Asia or China or India, or they came from Pakistan or somewhere kind of in that region. And as they are traveling together, they arrive into town, and they do kind of the customary thing. They come in and they find King Herod. And they say to him, "Hey, we're looking for this newborn king of the Jews." Now, in my mind, I can kind of picture the wise men expecting this to go a little bit different, right? If there's important news happening in a city, you would think that the king of the people would know about it. So they probably go to him saying, "Hey, he probably knows where this baby is, this newborn king of the Jews, and so we're going to find him." Even more so, maybe they even thought that it was going to be King Herod's baby. Maybe they thought, well, we're going to go here and give our gifts to King Herod's baby. And they show up at the palace expecting this was going to be the end of their journey. But it gets a little bit awkward, right? They show up and they're like, "Hey, we're looking for this baby. We can't wait to see him." And King Herod has no clue what they're talking about. And they have this kind of awkward, "Oh, you're not the father" moment, right? Where kind of is like this moment where the thing that they're probably expecting is not happening. And so King Herod is kind of upset by this, and he's frustrated and distraught by this. And a little bit of context about King Herod: he actually was a Jewish man who kind of left the Jewish faith in order to pursue his political ambitions in Rome. And so he got placed into a position of kind of being a governor over the Jewish people. But he didn't like just being the governor. In fact, he gave himself the title, calling himself the King of the Jews. And so when these wise men ask, hey, where's this new King of the Jews? He's deeply disturbed. I can just imagine in his mind, and maybe you can just start to picture that all of the things that he had worked so hard for, all of his political ambitions now are in threat because of this little baby. And so he starts to be distraught and upset. But let's keep reading what happens. It says in verse 4, so he, King Herod, called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, where is the Messiah supposed to be born? In Bethlehem, in Judea, they said, for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah. For a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd for my people, Israel. Then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. Then he told them, go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child. And when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too. After this interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them, and it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasure chest and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. When it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. All right, so this kind of concludes the entire story of the wise men. This is really the only things that we see about the wise men in the Bible. We don't know too much of where they're coming from. We don't know how many of them there were, if it was a big caravan or just 3 guys bringing gifts. We don't really know too much, but what we see is that they traveled a long distance, probably hundreds of miles, to come and to worship and to bring gifts to Jesus. And so this is really going to be the aspect of worship that we're going to focus on today. We're going to look at worship through giving. Now, I think that in order to understand giving as a part of worship, we need to first answer the question of why do we give? What's the purpose or the motivation for the reason that we give? And there's really 2 reasons that I think that we should give. And so we're going to explore those 2 areas today as we look at the lives of the wise men. The first one is this. The first reason or motivation is out of recognition or appreciation. Recognition and appreciation. And so maybe in your life, as you're getting all of your holiday shopping done and all your Christmas presents wrapped, you probably have bought presents for other people. And those are people who are significant in your life. Maybe it's a father or a mother. Maybe it's a grandparent. Or maybe it's your children. Maybe it's even a boss or a coworker. But the idea of giving a gift to them signifies that you recognize that they are an important part of your life. That whatever their role is, that you recognize and appreciate what they do as a part of your life. And with the wise men, I see that it's no different. I think that their idea of bringing gifts came out of this recognition for who Jesus was. And I think that we can especially see that through the gifts that they brought. Now, these gifts weren't just any gifts that you would bring to any baby shower. They weren't just gifts that you would give to any person. These were very special, significant, and meaningful gifts. And the first one that we saw that they gave was gold. Now, gold, it was a gift that was truly fit for a king. It was a gift that was customary to bring to royalty. So if a king had a baby or if there was a royalty that you were visiting, you were expected to bring some precious metal. And so we see that the wise men recognized that Jesus would be a significant person here on earth. But it doesn't stop there. We see the next gift that they give was frankincense. And frankincense was an oil or a resin that they would use in the temple as part of worship. And so as they went into the temple, they would burn this frankincense either as an oil, and it would kind of fill up the whole room with this fragrance. And it was something that would help them to kind of focus and think about God. And so as they would burn this in the temple, it was a big aspect of worshiping God when they went to the temple. So the wise men bring frankincense straight to Jesus. And what they're saying here is that they recognize that Jesus is worthy to be worshiped. That they recognize that this isn't just a king baby, but this is God himself. And so they bring gold and frankincense. And then the last one they bring is myrrh. And I would encourage you, probably not your go-to gift if you are going on a baby registry. Probably don't bring them myrrh. But it still had a lot of meaning. And here's what it was. Myrrh was actually an embalming oil. It was an oil that was used in death. And it was something that they would put all over the body after someone had died in order to preserve the body until they were ready to be buried. And so this doesn't seem like a very good baby gift, right? I probably would be a little disturbed if someone gave me this today for our baby. But the idea was that the wise men recognized the significance of Jesus. They recognized that this little baby had a life purpose, and it was to be a sacrifice. That the purpose of Jesus was to die so that we could be reconciled with God. And so the wise men, they gave these significant gifts, these meaningful gifts, and they gave their very best. And in our lives, in our worship, we have the responsibility to give and to worship in the same way. Now, I think that in order to understand our responsibility of giving, we need to look back and truly understand the history of giving in the Bible. And so I want to look at that real quick. Now, in the history of the Bible, we look and we see that those who followed God were required by the law to give 10% of their income back to God. Now, I am not very good at math. I don't know if anyone else struggles with math. So I like to break this down in a little bit more tangible way. So if you owned 100 goats, then at the end of the year, it was your responsibility to go and to give 10 of those goats back to God. You'd take them to the temple and give them to God as out of recognition and appreciation for who God was in your life. If you owned a barley field and you had 10 bushels of barley at the end of the year, you would take one of those bushels and you would take it to the temple and you would give it to the temple as a form of worship unto God. If you had pigeons and maybe you had 35 pigeons, that means that you would go and give God 3.5 pigeons. I don't know. That's kind of an awkward number, right? You're like, God, which end do you want, right? I don't know how that works. But the idea was that you were giving back to God out of recognition and appreciation for who he was, that you would, at the end of the year, go and give a portion back to him out of this recognition. And they did this at the end of the year because unlike today we know what our income is. If you sign up for a job, you know what you're going to make throughout the year. But for them, they didn't know, right? If you are breeding goats, you had no clue if you were going to have 16 kids at the end or if you were only going to have 2. And so this is why every year it was a big to-do that they would go to the temple and give their tithes to God. And we saw that they did this as an offering to God out of the recognition and appreciation they had. And this really was known as tithing. It's the 10% of what you owned or what you have acquired in that year. Now, if they had a bigger harvest in the year, then they would bring that bigger 10% to God. They would bring the best of what they had to God. And it was a sign of worship to say, God, I recognize that the blessings that I have, that the good things that I have in my life are from you. And so I still want to, even though I have a lot this year, I still want to give you the full 10% of what I'm required to give because it shows that you are the one who has blessed me in the first place. And if they had a very low year, they would do the same thing. They would say, you know what, God, I'm struggling this year. I don't have a lot of crops. My crops didn't bloom the way I was hoping, but they were still faithful to go and to give their 10% to God out of a recognition that, God, you are still the one who provides. Whether I have a lot or a little, you're the God who takes care of me. You're the God who provides for all of my needs. And so they were faithful to give this 10% every year at the end of the year. Now, a lot of times I talk to people and they say, well, you know what? We don't really have to tithe anymore, right? This idea of tithing, it was kind of an Old Testament law. It's not something we're required to do anymore. But that's not exactly true. Sure, maybe we aren't required by law to do it, but it's not just an Old Testament practice. It's not just an old law. In fact, we see it happen in the New Testament as well, the second half of the Bible. And we see Jesus himself talk about tithing. And he doesn't just talk about tithing at the minimum. He actually takes it a step further and says, listen, yeah, you should be tithing, but you also should have things right in your heart. Yeah, you should be tithing and should be giving, but you also should be taking it even further, kind of like Jesus did with a lot of the other laws. And so I would encourage us today to not dismiss this idea of tithing, to not just dismiss this idea that, well, maybe this doesn't apply to us or maybe this doesn't matter anymore. And rather, I would encourage us to shift our perspective. Rather than to think about it as something that maybe we don't need to do, let's start to shift and think about tithing as a form of worship. Let's think about what it means to really worship God through our giving. And so we're going to kind of continue in this. And I think that maybe you're sitting here today and you say, you know what? Well, Eli, yeah, you kind of have to say this stuff, right? You're the pastor of the church and the tithes go to help make sure that the church functions. And so it's kind of your job or your responsibility to make sure that the church has enough. And that is true. That is part of what God's plan for tithing is. It helps the church to function the way that God designed. But I really wanted to talk about this more so for this reason. In fact, maybe a month ago, I had someone come up to me and they said, Eli, you know what? You never really talk about tithing. And I really love that. It shows that you don't just care about our money. And at first I was like, yeah, that's a nice feeling, right? We don't really talk about money. We don't pass the bucket around. I don't want to ever people to feel like they have to give or that we're pressuring them to give or that's all we care about. But as I thought about it a little bit more, I thought, man, we don't really talk about tithing a lot because of kind of the awkward or the stigma behind it. But the reality is that I think that we miss out on worshiping God in the full aspect that he deserves when we just simply say, well, this doesn't matter or this doesn't apply to me. I think sometimes we miss out not only on that, but God also gives a lot of promises to people who tithe. In fact, it's one of the only things in the Bible he says, why don't you try it out? He says, test me, try tithing and see what happens. I want to bless you and I'm going to promise to take care of you in so many ways when you are faithful to give out of this recognition and appreciation of who I am. And so I would encourage us, again, not to just dismiss the idea of tithing, but really to shift our focus from a duty that we just kind of have to do to look at it as an area that we can worship God through recognition and appreciation of who he is and what he's done in our lives. And maybe in your life, you're at a place where you say, you know what, I've had a really great year financially. A lot of things have kind of come together. I got a raise at my work, or maybe I got a new job and things are working out well. Well, I'd encourage you, just like the Israelite people, maybe that's an opportunity for you to worship God, to say, you know what, God, I recognize that these blessings, these things that are going well in my life, these are from you. And so I want to turn around and give you back this percentage because you are worthy, and I recognize that these good gifts come from you. Or maybe you're here and you're kind of in a hard place financially. Maybe you say, you know what, I lost my job, or I'm out of work, or I had to take a pay cut in order to keep my job. And maybe you're sitting here today and you're like, this is a hard thing. Well, let me encourage you that this is a chance to worship God as well, to say, you know what, God, I'm struggling. I'm dealing with a lot. I don't know how I'm going to hold things together, but I still recognize and trust who you are. And I appreciate who you've been in my life. And so I'm going to be faithful to worship you in the way that you require of me, in the way that you deserve. And so I would encourage us to step into this idea of tithing because I really believe that it shows a recognition and an appreciation for God. But thankfully, this isn't where God wants us to stay. He doesn't want us simply to give out of obligation. God, in his goodness, he wants us to experience him in so many more ways. And so we're going to move into kind of our second part of this. Now, I might be in the small minority here, but I love Christmas shopping. Anyone else in that category? You're just like, I love Christmas shopping. I don't care about the busyness of the store. I don't care about how long the lines are. I love Christmas shopping. And I'll go to the stores and I will walk up and down every single aisle of every single store. Now, my wife thinks I'm crazy. We'll be walking. She's like, why do you need to go down here? Like, why are you going down the pet food aisle? We don't have a pet. I'm like, I don't know. Like, I love the idea of walking around and kind of sparking the ideas and getting creative and having ideas for the kids and for other people. And so I love to walk up and down every single aisle. Well, recently I was walking up and down the aisle of a store. I think I was at TJ Maxx. And as I was walking up and down every aisle, I couldn't help but notice that there were a couple there. And there was this couple, and they started kind of complaining, and they were kind of arguing, kind of complaining. Now, typically, I try to just mind my own business. I don't make it a habit to listen to other people's conversations, but it was kind of hard. They were being kind of loud, and we were like right in the same aisle. And as they were shopping in the toy section, I just heard them being like, well, why do we have to buy this stuff anyways? Why do we have to get this? I mean, we know Caden is going to be done with it by the end of the day, and he's going to move on to the next toy. And then they kind of kept going, and as they're looking through toys, they're like, what about this for the little brat? I was like, my face, I don't know that I held it together. I just tried to turn away because I don't know. Like, I was looking at them, and as they were having this conversation, I almost went up to them and asked them a question. And I just really wanted to ask them and say, well, why are you buying a present then? I mean, if you're not finding joy in it, and if you don't think he's going to like it, not like condescending, not trying to put you down, but like, what's your kind of motivation for giving? Because for me, I love shopping because I love giving to my kids. I think it's so fun as I'm picking things out and putting them in the cart just to imagine what my kids' expression will be, or even as I'm wrapping up the presents, or as I'm looking for things that I know that my wife needs or will make her life easier. It brings me joy and it makes me excited to want to give. It's not out of obligation. It's not because I feel like they're going to think I'm a failure of a father, or that they're going to hate me or be mad at me if I don't get the right present. It's because I love them so much. That's my motivation for giving. That's my motivation. And I think that this is really what brings us to our second observation. The second thing that we should do as we worship through giving is that it's out of love, not out of obligation. See, I think so many times we think of giving to God kind of like a tax, right? We think of it like, oh, well, you know, God's going to take a percentage of my money. And I know that whenever I do this with the government and I have to pay my taxes at the end of the year or throughout the year, I know I'm never looking to give more, right? I don't know anyone who's like, I can't wait to pay my taxes this year. I think sometimes that's how we think about it when we think about giving to God. But the reality is it's not in that same category at all. It should be more of thinking like how we give to our families. We give to our families because we love them, because we're excited about them, because we appreciate them, because we know that it makes them happy. And it's the same way that our giving should be with God, not out of obligation, just because that's what God takes from us or what he requires from us, but out of joy and out of love. Now, I think that as we look at giving as part of worship, we should think of it in this same way. Now, in order to understand this, I want to look back to the Old Testament again. Remember, we said that it was a requirement by law that each person who followed God had to give 10% of their income. Now, to us, that seems like a lot, and maybe it seems like, okay, well, I'll do that, and that's kind of the minimum. But the truth is, they hardly ever just gave the minimum. That was just the end of the year thing that they would give as a form of their tithe, but they would give every single time that they would go to the temple. That's kind of mind-blowing, right? They're already giving 10% of their crops or 10% of their income, and yet still, every time they went to worship God, they would try to give at least a small offering to say, God, I'm grateful and I love you. It's not just what is required of me. I'm not just giving the bare minimum because that's what you require, but God, I love you, and it's not out of my obligation, but I want to give you above and beyond because that's what you're worth. I think for us, we need to shift our perspective of what giving looks like. Not to be an obligation or not to be something that's taken away from us, but to be something that we are giving back to God, something that we are giving to Him, something that He deserves, something that came from Him in the first place. As we kind of get ready to wrap this up and close here, I want to acknowledge the fact that it can sometimes be difficult to give. The reality is that giving is not always easy, and that's okay. It's not supposed to be. Remember, this is part of our worship. Our worship to God is not meant to be easy in our lives. This is an aspect of how we worship God, and none of the aspects of how we are supposed to worship Him are meant to be easy or pain-free. The reality is that as we worship God, it requires sacrifice. I mean, I think about the wise men and what they brought. They didn't bring copper and olive oil and some cheap perfume like Axe body spray or something, right? They brought the very best. They brought the very best thing that they could offer. They brought meaning and significant gifts. That's because they recognized that their giving was a part of worship. They recognized that as they gave to Jesus, that they were really worshiping. I think that should change our perspective. And the reality is that true worship in any form, it requires sacrifice. I even think about all of these aspects that we talked about in this series. I think about how we talked about Joseph and his obedience to God. Well, think about the sacrifice that was required of that, right? He gave up of his own will and his own desires to follow what God wanted. That requires sacrifice. I think about Mary sacrificing her time, giving of her precious time. And man, I know that time is precious. I know that we have a limited amount of time, but yet it requires sacrifice, and we worship God through sacrificing and giving our time to spend time with Jesus. I think about the shepherds proclaiming and going out and telling every person the good news of Jesus' birth. I think about in our lives that requires sacrifice to do. Sometimes it's a little bit awkward, and we have to put down our own inhibitions or our own fears or our own doubts. We have to sacrifice those and step out of our comfort zones. I think about the wise men, how they gave gifts to God. Giving in any capacity is difficult. And so I don't just want to ignore giving of our finances just because it's not easy to talk about. In fact, this is where true worship comes in. True worship comes through our sacrifice. It comes from us giving up something that is precious to us. The truth is, we don't worship God because it's easy. We worship God because it's right. We worship God because He's worthy. We worship Him because He deserves honor. Listen, I want you to experience the full benefits of worship. I want you to experience the full spectrum of all that God has. I think that we need to give God what He deserves. Give Him the very best that we have in every area. And I'll say one more thing kind of as we wrap this up today, is that probably the most said thing whenever I have this conversation with people is I hear, well, you know what, we worship through serving. We serve at the church a lot, and we give of our time. And you know what, I serve in the kids, and I work with the littles, and I work to clean the church, and I do things, and I worship God in that way. And you know what, you're absolutely right. That is a way that we worship God. We talked about that, about serving God and about being with God, about giving God our time. That is absolutely a way that we worship God. But if we just worship God in that way, I think sometimes we miss out on a full aspect of who God is. See, just from serving at the church, you can't learn about trust and dependency of God as your provider. You miss out on an idea of God being the one who leads you and takes care of your finances. You miss out on a whole aspect of giving God what He's worthy of. And the truth is, I think the things that are hardest for us to give up, the things that are hardest for us to give, are probably the things that we should give the most. That's really what shows that we're willing to worship God, that we're willing to give the things that hurt us the most. Maybe you're sitting here today and you say, you know what? I have no problem writing a check to the church. I love getting involved, and I'm just going to write a check or put some cash in there, but you don't want to get involved. Well, listen, maybe that's the most important area for you to give up and to worship God with, to say, God, I'm going to sacrifice my time. I know that it's difficult for me in my busy season, but I'm going to sacrifice the thing that's most valuable to me. Maybe you're here and you say, you know what, I serve every week and I'm consistent and I love being at church, but you have a hard time giving financially or giving money. Well, listen, I would encourage you, that's probably a sign that that's the area that you need to give most. That's probably the area that you need to let go of, and that's probably going to be the most painful yet wonderful worship experience. We don't want to just worship God in ways that we're comfortable. Worship requires sacrifice. True worship of any form requires that we give our best. So I would encourage you, whatever you're at today, whatever you struggle with, as we look at all of these aspects of worship, don't get stuck in just worshiping God when it's easy. Don't get stuck in just worshiping God in the aspect or in the vein that is the easiest for you. Look at the ways, identify the ways that it's hard for you to let go. And I truly believe that's what's going to be the most meaningful worship to God. That's what it looks like for us today to give our gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So I would encourage you, let's get ready to close here today. I would really encourage you, if you have missed a week of this series, to go back and watch it, because I really believe God is worthy of all of our worship. Not just one aspect, not just the one or another aspects, not just songs, not just serving, not just giving. Go back and watch every aspect and start to incorporate them in your life. I really hope and desire that we will be a church that worships God in the way that He truly deserves. So let's pray together. God, we are so grateful that You are a God who is worthy to be worshiped. God, that You are not just an idol who is there and who we can't see or experience. God, but I thank You that You are alive and active today. God, that You care about us, that You see us, that You know us. God, I pray that You would help us to give our very best to You, God, in every area of our lives, of our time, of our finances, of our desires, of our abilities. God, let us worship You in the way that You deserve. Let us sing to You passionately. God, let us not sit on the sideline, because You are worthy in every area of our lives. God, we love You and we're so grateful. I pray specifically for this week that You would help us to be a generous church, that You would help us to think of our giving as worship to You, not as an obligation, not as just simply a responsibility. God, I pray we would be faithful, even when it's hard, even when it's difficult, that we would give out of recognition for You, that would give out of our appreciation for you, God, but I pray that you help us to develop and be motivated by our love for you. God, we need you in our lives, and we thank you that you make yourself so available to us. God, we thank you for the story of Christmas and for all the things that it teaches us. We thank you that you invite us into this story. In Jesus' name, amen. And guys, I'm so glad that you were here with us today. Again, Merry Christmas. I hope you have a wonderful time whether you're with your families or whether you're doing festivities or whatever you're doing. I'm so glad that you were part of this series. I hope to see you back next week. And then in January, we're starting a brand new series called Nasty Habits. And I'm really excited about it because we're going to be talking about maybe not the things that we think, but the nasty habits that we allow into our lives. And really, it's going to be a journey of thinking, becoming more like God. It's a great series to invite someone to. You know that you have friends and family who maybe are thinking about coming back to church. This is the perfect opportunity to invite them back to this brand new series that we're going to be doing. So I love you guys. I'm so glad you are here, and I hope you have a very Merry Christmas. Thanks.